Hello and welcome to pmblounge.com. Today we are discussing the collect requirements process, and we've already discussed plan scope management process that also belongs to the scope management knowledge area. This again is another process in the scope management knowledge area. I'll link to the entire playlist of scope management knowledge area. So if you're already trying to read or gain knowledge about scope management, you can go over the playlist. We have done an entire playlist and coverage of the integration management knowledge area. The link to that playlist will also be in the description below. And as always, whenever we discuss processes like these, there is always a supporting article available over at pmblounge.com website. That will also be available in the description below. So the link to that article will also be available in the description below. So without further ado, let's talk about the collect requirements process and let's get started. So first up, where does it fall in the PGK mapping, right? The process groups knowledge area mapping, which lists all the processes. Where does the collect requirements process fall? And we typically discuss this as well I try to discuss that for all the processes that we cover so that, it puts everything in perspective. And so collect requirements, like I mentioned earlier, is another process in the planning process group corresponding to the scope management knowledge area. So we're talking about scope management knowledge area, and the planning process group is the process group. There are 5 process groups. If you are just giving you a refresher, initiation, then planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So there you have it. Like I mentioned, the 5 process groups, you can uh, check that out: initiating, planning, executing, MNC, closing, and then project integration management. Project scope management is what we are talking about here. So like I mentioned earlier, and it's written in the line above, that this is a process in the planning process group. So check out planning process group and the scope management knowledge area. If you see, it's encircled in red. This is the collect requirements process. We have already covered plan scope management process, and we have already covered all the processes that you see in the project integration management knowledge area as well. So today we are talking about collect requirements. So this is where it falls. Let's get into the definition of collect requirements. So collect requirements is a process. The process is all about determining, documenting, and managing stakeholders' requirements to meet the project objectives. So you're determining what the requirements are, what the project requirements are. You are also documenting those requirements. You cannot keep all the requirements in your head, right? So you need efficient ways of documenting the requirements. Some people use Word documents, some people will use an Excel file, some might even have web-based tools to document the requirements. So different organizations will have different ways of doing this. So like I said, this process is also going to prepare a plan of how you're going to not just determine what the requirements are, but you're also going to document those requirements, right? And managing, so you need to manage those requirements as well. So requirements can come from anyone. It's we tend to think that the project sponsor, the person who's paying for the project, is the one who is going to give the requirements. That might not be true at all times, right? Project requirements can come from sponsor, project requirements can come from the users of the product of the project, right? Project requirements can come from your own project team as well, right? So let's say you're doing a certain project. Your designer may come up and tell you that there is a way you can enhance the functionality of the product of the project, and that is a requirement. Whether you accept it or not, whether you take it to the sponsor, whether you take it to the folks who have the authority to accept requirements, that's another thing, right? But project requirements can come from anyone. That is what my point is. So you need to manage those requirements and you need to meet the project objectives. So the next point here is about project objectives. So the very definition of collect requirements says that you need to meet the project objectives. And in order to meet the project objectives, you need to clearly define and understand what those objectives are, right? So that is why collect requirements is one of the most important processes in project management. The Whatever that you're doing, right, in your entire project, whatever that you're doing, your ultimate goal is to meet the objectives of the project. And how can you meet the objectives of the project if they are not even clearly defined? You are a project manager, you are given a project, and you're told, okay, you need to deliver an e-commerce website. That's all the requirement is. How can you even start the work, right? You don't have any you don't have the clear project objectives. You don't even know what kind of e-commerce website you need to build. You don't even know what is the functionality being expected out of the e-commerce website. You don't even know what platform, what technology you need to use. You don't even know if it will be targeted towards what age group, what demography will that e-commerce website be targeted, what are the products that will be listed, right? You need to know all these to be able to achieve project objectives. And that is why collecting requirements is, like I mentioned earlier, one of the most important processes in project management. This process also deals with some decision making techniques, right? And we will talk about these techniques. And there are some collecting requirements techniques as well. So, you cannot, like I talked about the e-commerce website, right? There are so many requirements. There has to be certain techniques to be able to make sure that the requirements are collected comprehensively, and you have the requirements that you need basically, right? So there have to be certain techniques that you need to employ to be able to meet to be able to complete your requirements document, and to be able to meet the project objectives, and to be able to define those project objectives, right? So definitely there are certain requirements, collecting techniques as well, collecting requirement techniques. There are certain decision making techniques which are also involved in this collect requirements process. So we will be talking about these two in future projects. We have already made a video on uh, oh, did I mention future projects? I wanted to mention in future videos. So we will be talking about the decision making techniques and the collecting requirements techniques in a future video, right? So subscribe to this. That's another reason you should be subscribing to us, right? We have already talked about functional and non-functional requirements. So if you have no idea what requirements are, right, that will be a good video to start with. The link in the description that is about the scope management playlist has the video on functional and non-functional requirements as well, but I will individually link the video of functional and non-functional requirements in the description, just so it's easier for you to find that out. So that's about it. That's about the requirements and how you can collect the requirements. Let's get down to some more details about the collect requirements process. Now, as a project manager or someone who is responsible for collecting requirements, right? So you in some of the projects, the project manager could himself or herself be responsible for collecting requirements, while in certain projects, in certain organization, there could be other resources helping the project manager, or other resources completely responsible for collecting requirements, right? So in either way, in either condition, when you're writing the PMP exam, you need to assume that it is project manager's responsibility to collect requirements, right? So when you're collecting requirements, you are not just responsible for collecting requirements, but it is also your responsibility to ensure that the requirements are collected. Of course, they need to be collected, clearly defined, so to arrive at the clear project objective that we talked about. But the requirements not just are collected clearly, but they are also translated accurately throughout the project, right? So let's say as a project manager, you collected certain requirements, right? And you documented those requirements. When you went on to design the project, and that I believe is my next point, right? So let's say you're doing a software project, okay? So if you have documented certain requirements and then you went on to the design phase, right? You need to make sure that the designers, the folks involved in designing, understand those requirements accurately, right? The translation of those requirements from your, requirements documentation, whatever it is done correctly. The translation is done correctly by the designers. Once the designers complete the design, it is project manager's responsibility to ensure that the design is correctly translated into the coding, right? Once coding is done, you need, as a project manager, you need to ensure that the testing is done correctly, accurately, and in in, in a corresponding fashion with what the requirements were, right? So I'll give a very basic example. Let's say the requirement of the project is to make sure that the website that you are creating, right, or a software that you are creating processes 100 financial transactions in 1 minute. If that is a requirement, you need to make sure the designer designs the software in that fashion that the tool or the website or the software is able to, process 100 transactions in 1 minute, right? You need to make sure that the coder, right, the developer, does the coding in a fashion that corresponds to this, right? That the tool or the software or the website is, or whatever the the product of the project is able to accept and process 100 transactions in a minute. But then if the tester is testing on something else, if the tester is testing whether, let's say, the what is the background color of the website, right? If that is what they are testing, then this entire requirement is in the soup, right? Because the testing was not done. That you need to make sure as a project manager that the tester also tests whether the website, the tool, the product of the project is able to process 100 transactions in a minute, right? So you see the correlation, right, between you noting down the requirements to the designer, making sure the requirement is translated correctly to the design, to the developer or the coder, making sure that necessary coding is done to meet the requirements, and then finally to the tester to make sure that the requirements are tested. So based on the use cases that they use for their testing, you need to make sure that all the requirements are tested and then finally deployed. So this translation of requirements is also a responsibility of the project manager. And we'll look into some of the techniques that are used in the industry to do this smoothly, right? So that is all that we had in this video. Hope you could learn a lot about collect requirements. This is, like I mentioned, a very important process, not just from PMP exam perspective, but especially from a real life project management perspective. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to, check out the related videos and some of the future videos that are coming around the same topic and more topics on PMP. Check us out on our social media, facebook.com/PMP Lounge and twitter.com/PMP Lounge. And as always, do check out the website pmplounge.com, your number one free resource for PMP certification and project management industry information. Thank you.